Hi, welcome to Africa in Perspective. My name is Nelda and I make videos about Africa from Mondays to Fridays. Today we're going to be addressing a very popular question that a lot of people ask, and that question is, why is Africa underdeveloped? So, we're first of all just going to address this idea of Africa's underdevelopment. I think when people say that Africa is underdeveloped, we are being quite harsh on the continent and we are overlooking a lot of its social, economic, and political improvement that a lot of people have actually noticed over the last couple of years, especially when you consider that the first African country to get independence only got its independence in 1957, and that was Ghana. Shout out to Ghana. So, with that said, we're going to look at, instead of phrasing it as three main reasons as to why Africa is still underdeveloped, we're going to look at this as three main reasons that are obstacles to Africa's journey towards development. And so we immediately are not going to we're not going to ignore the elephant in the room, and that is colonialism. I know that sounds very strange that we're still talking about colonialism to this day. And I also recorded a video a couple months ago where I talked about a very similar topic about why Africa is still struggling with poverty. And I bashed the idea that I just basically was against this idea of talking about colonialism this, colonialism that. But when you're talking about pure economic development, one of the main things that is stopping the continent of Africa from proceeding at a high pace or a higher pace than what we are seeing right now is the fact that even though slavery and quote unquote colonialism has quote unquote ended, I'm using a lot of quotes, but even though that has ended per se, there's still a lot of things that we're dealing with as a continent. So I'm just going to be reading from my notes because I don't want to skip anything at all. But typically when people talk about Africa and slavery, they look at the transatlantic slave trade because that has a lot to do with the Americas. So North America and South America. Oh yeah, that was right, North and South. And then people forget that there was also the Indian Ocean slave trade that took part on the eastern part of Africa. And then there was also the trans-Saharan slave trade that happened within the African continent. So 11 million Africans were forcibly taken to the Americas. That is 11 million people were taken from Africa towards the Americas. And that is an estimate, by the way. And that is just the ones who went to the Americas. We haven't talked about those who went towards Europe. We haven't talked about those who went towards Asia. So we lost a lot of, purely economically speaking, a lot of manpower. But also think about the psychological impact that had on African people and how to this day, during slavery, we were mistreated. We were viewed as less than. Our power was taken away by having our people taken away from us. And even with that being said, with slavery, one of the reasons that Europeans, particularly because they were the ones who were at the forefront of the slave trade, one of the reasons they came to the African continent was one, yeah, to take free/cheap labor. But the other reason was resources. And while they were doing that, they were not industrializing the African continent. They were just taking people, taking resources. And that affected us to this day, that we have become a continent that just gives. We just give. And everybody expects us to just keep giving. We're the gift that keeps giving. But that is one of the reasons that our development is slowing down, is because also even Africans ourselves, we have this notion that, Africa is the richest continent in the world in terms of resources. But what has that done for us? Because we're still, what has changed between what Europeans were doing in relation to Africa in the colonial era to what is happening right now? Because I don't think really much has changed at all. So when you look at how much the colonial era affected us as a continent, a lot of people wonder whether colonialism did more harm than good. And I see a lot of people debating this, which is, I think, nonsense, because there is no way you're arguing that colonialism did any good for us. I'm reading here in my notes, like by 1960, when a few countries in Africa had gotten independence, only 2% of global railway networks were in Africa, despite the fact that Africa is, some people say it's the second largest continent. I think it's the largest continent, but 2% of global railways were in Africa. 2%, guys, 2%. And even if beyond the infrastructure that they didn't develop, they were just taking resources. Also, the other thing that colonialism did that is still causing issues in Africa today is the borders they drew. Why is nobody talking about this? 44% of borders in Africa are just straight lines. They're just like, shoop, shoop, shoop. These people were not thinking. They were just drawing borders that looked pretty. They were like, oh my gosh, that looks really pretty. I'm just going to draw a line here. Oh, that's so cute. And they were splitting tribes. So if you look at the Maasai, for example, there is some in Kenya, some in Tanzania. That has led to a lot of conflicts, a lot of issues. When you hear that Africa is the continent that is leading in terms of conflict, why do you, like, gee, why do you think that is happening? So this is, although we can't keep leaning too much on colonialism as the main reason we haven't developed as much as we would like to, it's still a factor that needs to be addressed. But that is just one of the things that we can talk about. But the other thing is, which is why I was saying quote unquote colonialism, because I still think we are being colonized. And a lot of people talk about this in terms of addressing neo-colonialism, and neo is just a prefix that a lot of people use to connotate new. So it's just new colonialism. And one of the reasons I want to talk about this is because of the poor governance and governmental structures in Africa. And I think one of the reasons that is able to happen is because our leaders are still working hand in hand with the same countries that colonized us. I don't think I can trust any country other than, for example, Tanzania to take care of Tanzania's people. The only people that I expect to have Tanzania's best interest in mind are the leaders of Tanzania. And I think that is true for every African country. That if you're talking about Mali, for example, the one country, the one leader who has the best interest of Mali in mind should be the head of Mali's government. So when you see other countries, particularly European countries, trying to befriend your leaders, you should always be suspicious. I don't care what they're doing. I don't care if they're building roads. I don't care if they're giving you a lot of money. They're just like raining money on you. I don't care. You should always be suspicious when these external investors are coming into your country. It's good to have foreign investment. I'm all for foreign investment, but I think given the weak governmental structures that we have, it's always very suspicious, because you'd be like, what are our leaders giving these people, you know? And so one of the statistics that just blew my mind away is that from 1970 to 2008, $700 billion have been lost from 33 sub-Saharan African countries because of corruption. 700 billion, they have just left the country. Leaders are just stuffing them in their pockets, they're putting them in their offshore accounts, and people are still struggling in Africa. So 20 out of 54 African countries are still in conflict. They have conflicts in their countries. And again, it goes back to the borders I was talking about. When you hear people fighting in the DRC, people fighting in Rwanda, when you hear people fighting in Ethiopia, in Sudan, these were things that started years ago, and it had something to do with colonialism, yes, but the fact that it's still something that we haven't dealt with, it's an indicator that the conflicts going on in Africa are benefiting somebody, and they just don't care enough to want to change them. And so we're still struggling with a lot of very, very high poverty rates in the continent. And I'm just trying to see here if there is for example, I'm going to pick on Nigeria a little bit. $400 billion in oil revenue have been lost in Nigeria due to corruption since 1960. And when you compare the population in Nigeria that lives under the international extreme poverty line, that is 63% of Nigerians. 63% of Nigerians live in poverty. And that is not true just for Nigeria. If you look at South Sudan, for example, they've also lost they've lost a whole lot of money. 4 million people have been displaced in South Sudan since 2011 because their oil wealth is being stolen by elites. So it's kind of getting very embarrassing, guys. We should really start looking into this. But one of the other reasons that I think we especially need to talk about this is because if we have the effects of colonialism working against us and we have corruption working against us, the other thing we need to be concerned about is, which is what I was hinting at when I said the conflicts happening in the continent are benefiting somebody. We can't keep saying that Africa is the richest continent in terms of resources. We can't keep saying that. It's getting tiring. What are we doing with those resources? And shipping those resources out of the continent is not really going to help us. We need to start industrializing ourselves. We need to start making use of these resources. And one of the ways that we can do that is by putting our people to work. So every year, 12 million youth enter the job market in Africa, but only 3 million jobs are created. Where do you expect the 9 million are going to go? We need to start working on this. We need to start employing our own people. We can't expect Africans to keep leaving the continent to go work in the UK, to go work in the US. We can't keep experiencing that brain drain. We need to keep our youth in our continent. And the only way we're going to do that is by giving them opportunities to serve our country and to pay them really, really, really well. So and even if we're going to be exporting things, it's a good thing to export things, but we should also be working on industrializing at home, developing our local markets, and ensuring that we are at the forefront of using our resources for our own good. I think it's kind of crazy that we're importing things like eggs, things like toothpicks, things like sugar. I can understand importing a car, but importing maize, Africa, we need to be very, very serious. But that's all. There's so many statistics here. I don't even know how to just like reduce them, but I hope this video was helpful. I think those are the three main reasons Africa is just struggling a little bit to develop. It's just we are still dealing with remnants of colonialism, which is fine. It's expected. It's psychological. We still have very weak governments, and corruption is rampant, and we're also very slow to industrialize. Shipping resources is good, like I was saying, but let's try and build our own industries, which is why I'm all for entrepreneurship. If you have any business idea in your mind, go for it. Go for it, because you don't know what that could grow into someday. So hopefully this is a useful video for you, and feel free to subscribe, to like, to share, and to comment, and let me know if there are any other topics, any questions, any feedback. I'll take it all. So thank you so much for watching, and you'll see me in the next video.